Welcome, everyone. Last session before the morning break. I'm Martina, I'm your moderator, and it's my honor to introduce Richard Ettema to you, who's going to talk for the next 15 to 20 minutes. We'll make sure to have a bit of time for questions at the end, and I'll get back to you. Richard?
All right, thank you. So Richard Ettema, I work for a company called Aegis. For those of you who haven't heard of it, for those who have, I'm the lead architect developer for our FHIR testing platform called Touchdown. FHIR proficient, certified educator, been doing this for a long time, work primarily with the FHIR work group, conformance, but also contribute to the tooling that HL7 maintains as well. And I actually am the author of Aegis Wildfire, our reference implementation server we use in our testing environment. So I kind of coined this talk, requirements, where are the requirements? So we have implementation guides out there now. How many do we have out in the wild? Over 700 plus, 1,000, I don't know. It changes every day, right? Well, one of the things we want to take a look at is what is the current state of affairs with requirements definitions within an IG. And with the R5 release, we now actually have some new conformance resources that we can leverage in terms of defining our testing requirements, and we want to look to see how we might be able to apply them to our IGs today. And then, of course, where do we go from here? So, some questions for you. Where do you find the requirements in an implementation guide? Anybody? Well, hold on, come on. Let's be fair. There are requirements in the implementation guide. Don't you look for those normative verbs like shall and should and so forth? Well, we do find that they are somewhat scattered throughout the IG. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We need narrative, right, to help us understand with examples and so forth. But you'll find things on the home page. You'll find things on something called conformance or guidance. We now have the FHIR artifacts page, so all of your conformance resources are listed nicely there. Well, okay, great. Our requirements are there. We can kind of go through the IG. Where do we find test cases and definitions? Thank you. Typically, they're going to be outside the IG. Aegis, we work with the DaVinci accelerator, and we've been helping them out with testing of their various IGs. But they're not in the IG. We end up after the fact. So after the IG gets published, what happens? Oh, let's throw it over the wall and say, we'd like to have some tests defined. And how do we do testing? It's kind of after the fact. Well, that kind of begs the question, how do we know when we start to implement our implementation guide that it's conformant to the implementation guide? Well, without known complete good test case definitions, it's kind of difficult. We want to be able to make sure that we can run our implementations through test cases that exercise the functionality we expect to have them do. And we need to answer that question, that final question. How can we test that? And without, again, known good complete test case definitions, it's not that easy. So I've been talking at DevDays for a while. 2016 was the first time, but last year I came up with a fictitious IG called Developer Satisfaction. I had a much longer talk there, so I could go into much more detail. But the Developer Satisfaction IG is based on R4, and again, it's fictitious. Okay, I've got a couple profiles and so forth. Let's actually take a look at this thing. This is local on my machine because I don't trust the internet right now. So, as Lloyd, demonstrated in his last talk. But if we take a look at version .1 of our Developer Satisfaction IG, where do we find our requirements? Well, as you expect, like I just went through, the home page may have some information that kind of describes, some initial settings, but we also have things like a guidance, maybe a suite of pages that we can go through that kind of defines our actors that we have. So here I have 3 actors: provider, requester, and what else did I call it? Responder, thank you. So I tried to keep it relatively generic. I mean, you can keep going through guidance here, and maybe there's a conformance page. This is where you're probably going to find those nice normative verbs, shall, shoulds, and mays, and so forth. So this is a pretty important page. But again, you've got to start reading through narrative and kind of glean from this, what exactly do I need to build? Safety and security, maybe reference back to the FHIR spec. Testing right now, if we have anything, it's fairly minimal. We do have a test script resource in the FHIR spec, and so you can actually start building test definitions with test script. The current state of affairs right now, which is interesting because I actually work with the tooling, I got this in. If you go to, say, your profiles, and I have a profile on observation. Well, if you have test script resources that exercise your profile, the IG Publisher tooling from HL7 will now give you a new tab on your profile page called Testing. And this actually, whoops, there we go, make it nice and big for you here. This actually gives you links to test scripts that you have that you can reference and say, this is how I would test this profile. There's our test definitions. So this is kind of the initial stage where we're starting to introduce testing components right into our IG. Beyond this, that's pretty much what you're going to have. You're going to, maybe go for additional artifacts. Maybe you've got operation definitions, capability statements, and capability statements are also a great place because visualization through the IG Publisher, you get a lot of great stuff, especially if you're taking advantage of some of the extensions for the capability statement where you can put in some of those normative verbs and so forth. So this is a great place to go as well, too. But that's pretty much it in terms of what you're going to find generally with an IG. If you're lucky, you've got some test scripts that will help you define what you're going to be doing, okay? So that's kind of the state of affairs where we are today. And even then, that's kind of not too bad considering we can now start defining test scripts and get those integrated in. Well, the test script is one of our first testing conformance artifacts, and it's been around since DSTU2. I didn't know if you knew that or not, but it's been around for a while. And since DSTU2, we've had a number of testing platforms that are available. Crucible from MITRE, which is kind of morphed into Inferno now. NIST actually provides us with asbestos, and that's used heavily at the IG connectathons for the FHIR-based IG profiles. And then, of course, we have Aegis Touchdown, our platform, which has been around since DSTU2 as well, 2015. Well, now new for R5, we've got some additional resources. We have an actor definition. So we can now formally define the actors. Now, it's still just a narrative text for the actor, but now we actually have a place that we can reference. There's requirements resources now. So the requirements resource ties into the actor, and you can actually define requirements in a discrete set of statements within the requirement and it doesn't have to be tied directly to one actor, it could be multiple. But it provides a place for us to hang our real requirements. And we can tag them, give them identifiers and so forth, which makes them referenceable. And we can actually start to do some fun things with them. We also have a new thing called TestPlan. That's kind of made it in under the wire for R5, so it's still like FHIR maturity 0 right now. So, but I'm still working on R6 enhancements to these things, as we move forward. But this is now a place where we can actually start to define how are we going to test this, come up with our test cases, test runs, which can link back to test scripts. So now we can start to join and link these things together in a meaningful way. Well, how do we apply these things? So I have version .2 of my developer satisfaction IG that we can now dive into. And let's come over here to the next tab. And so here's version .2. Amazing, right? No, not so much right now. But you'll notice all of the same information that we've had before is still there. Our conformance page is still there. We don't want to lose that information. A lot of work went in by the IG authors to come up with this information, so we don't want to lose it. But we now want to take this information and now start to condense it and put it into real requirements definitions, if you will. So now instead of just having a testing page, I have a requirements page. I'm actually going to save that because I want to show you that in a little bit. But now look at our FHIR artifacts. So it's not just capability statements and profiles and so forth. We now have actors and requirements. The IG Publisher does this for us. So as long as you define these things and you use the IG publication tooling, it'll all come in for free. So actors are now our formal actor definitions. So I can now look at my responder actor, and it displays just like you would any other conformance resource in the IG. Again, it's narrative content, but again, it's important to have it as a real resource so that we can actually now reference it and hang stuff off of it. If we go back over here, we now have requirements. And the requirements, and this is just the IG publication rendering for the narrative text version of this, but here you can see I now have a number of statements that actually have identifiers and now markdown text to specifically say, this is my codified specific requirement that I'm going to state that my implementation must follow when the implementers start to develop. So this is where, again, you put in normative verbs, shall and should and so forth. And so the requirement structure allows for this. And then, of course, we have TestPlan. So I can run over here and show you TestPlan. And I'm just picking on the responder actor here just for fun. But the idea is that now I have test cases that I can define with test runs. And this is just the current structure of TestPlan right now. And again, I am making some modifications and enhancements for the R6 release as we move forward here. But notice now, our test runs can link to those test scripts. So now I have the actual actionable, executable test definitions that I can tie back to my test cases for my test runs and link them all together. Now, I kind of skipped over that page that I showed you before because now that we have things that get referenced, there are links between these things, we can do some fun things with this information now. Ever think of a requirements traceability matrix that you might want to have in an IG? So I can now map my requirements to my test cases and my test cases to my test scripts. What's the coverage that I might have of test definitions to my requirements? So this is a great way to start to take a look at this information. And so you can see for my provider actor, my requirements that I've defined, I now have my statements identified, the test cases and runs that point to them, and the test scripts that point to those, and now I can actually do some nice metrics here. So my IG coverage of this information is about 66% for TestPlan, and then 33% for test scripts. So I know I've got some work to do here to kind of flesh out some of this stuff. If I go to my other requirements for my other actors, I can see that I've satisfied, if you will, at 100% all the requirements that I have currently right now in the IG. Obviously, as we start going through and doing more requirements, this will change. We'll have to kind of work our way through and keep up to date with all this. But that's kind of what we can now do. And I don't know if you noticed something here. Hang on. What version of FHIR am I using for this IG? R4. Well, wait a minute. These are R5 conformance resources. What's going on? The IG publisher tooling is very nice to me. It allows me to actually take R5 conformance resources. I have to qualify that. Conformance resources only. There is a conversion package in the tooling that will actually, and I wrote this, by the way, so I wrote the conversion for requirements and TestPlan and so forth and got it into the core library. Yes, I did. I can see Gino back there going, what?
We're still working on the cross-version extension.
I know. Well, and it actually takes advantage of those. Those cross-version extensions are actually the glue, if you will, or the representation of these things. So if I go to my requirements resource, and let's say I want to look at the JSON representation of it, you look at this thing and you go, oh, then the rendering here says, well, that's a requirements resource. No, it's not. Let's look at the raw JSON. What is it? It's a basic resource. Because all that it's done is it's taken the R4 basic resource and then built all of the R5 resource elements as extensions into BASIC. So under the covers, it's doing that work for me, so I don't have to worry about it. But from a rendering perspective, it's all just available in my R5 IG. Again, you can only, R4 IG, you can only do this with the conformance resources. So just be aware of that. Okay? Let's see here. I am running out of time, so let's just get back. So there's those requirements traceability matrix things that I did. I had to do this manually, by the way. So one of the things that I want to work on is how do we actually start to improve the IG publisher now to build this stuff for me, so I don't have to do it manually. And so those are some of the things that we want to start thinking about as we go forward. So the whole idea is, where do we go from here? Well, we want to start incorporating these conformance resources in our IGs, because we want to be able to start codifying and actually building out requirements in a very discrete way, and using and taking advantage of these things. As I mentioned, update, enhance the tooling to make sure that we can leverage these things in more meaningful ways. Start building those RTMs, start building those coverage matrices, if you will. And of course, we want to engage with IG authors going forward to help them understand how to do this. One of the ways is, I've actually been tasked, and I haven't gotten to it, too many things on my plate, but the HL7 sample IG needs to be updated to actually show this stuff. So I'm going to take what I've learned so far and hopefully get that sample IG updated so that IG authors have some sort of guideline to follow in that regard. There are additional DevDays talks today, so I want to do a shout out here for other talks on testing and implementation. So Gino, sitting in the audience here, he's got a talk tomorrow morning on making implementation guides implementable. That seemed kind of a nice follow-on to what I'm talking about here. Thank you, Gino. And then Joe Lamy, another colleague here at Aegis, is going to be talking tomorrow morning, later in the morning, about follow the bouncing ball, okay, about how we can leverage client-side testing. So how do we implement testing our clients, not just our servers? And another talk by Lloyd McKenzie again tomorrow, obligations and simplifying test case generation. Okay, so I'm not even going to talk about obligations. I don't want to, other than say the word, but if you want to learn more about the obligations in FHIR, come to Lloyd's talk tomorrow as well. So here's my contact information. You can find me on Whova. I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, X. Okay, and Q&A.
Yes,
Gino.
we have a bit of time.
Yep.
And
Gino.
I have Mike. Gino, this is very complicated to get there.
I should have sat in a better spot. Has there been any consideration of a structure for keeping the test plans and test cases separate from the IG, but still referencing them?
That was actually something I've also been exploring that I first started with. So I came up, you know how we have implementation guide, IG. I actually came up with the concept of a testing guide, a TG, that would be a companion guide to the implementation guide, because your testing requirements are going to evolve and change, most likely separately from the implementation guide. So if you bury all that in the implementation guide, you can't change it without changing the IG version or so forth. So yes, that is a very good consideration, something I've thought of. But again, it's kind of like update the publishing tooling and how do you reference back and keep them in,
I would definitely +1 for that.
Yeah, so there's some logistical issues that need to be worked out in there. But I have thought about it, yes. In the back there.
Yes, Mario, and then John, I get to you. And then it's time, I think, for a break.
Thank you, Richard. Excellent presentation. Quick question on when you're calculating coverage. What if I want 10 negative tests? How does that impact my test coverage score? And, oh, by the way, there is a precedent with publishing different packages. The examples right now, I think, are separate documents within the IG publishing. Graham has done some of that work.
Well, so if you have examples in your IG, they will be published as a separate zip or TGZ, offering. I think it's a zip. So you have your example zip, you have your validation package TGZ, and so forth. But in terms of the first part of the question, negative testing is, I haven't thought about it as deeply as you probably have, I know. But the idea is it's still part of your overall testing requirements, right? So my requirement is going to have a positive aspect to it, most likely. I shall do this or I should do this. But how do I know that the implementation is going to work correctly if bad data comes along the wire or there's negative types of things that happen. So that's all going to feed into the types of test definitions that you're going to be building. So right now, from a coverage perspective, it's really going to be just what I have right now, test script to test plan to requirements. That's another great consideration that we're going to have to think about is how does negative testing, which really should be predominantly what you want to do with your testing, how does that factor into things like coverage? So to be determined.
The final one here.
Thanks, Richard. This reminded me of the IHE process. I don't know if you had any alignment with the IHE or they're going to be using some of this. But my question has to do with now that you have actor definitions, can you start to define sequence diagrams, component diagrams, things that usually you have to manually do in these IGs that would help with comprehensibility, I guess you'd say?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, again, we're kind of at the beginning stages of getting these types of resources in place to help define these sorts of things. But sequence diagrams, you'll probably find them in the narrative of the IG. Just like you would in an IHE profile definition, you're going to find these sequence diagrams. I've been to the IG Connectathon before, and I've worked, with those, so I know what you're talking about. Sequence diagrams are a way, think about it as a workflow, right? And so the test definitions, the test scripts are actually designed for workflow testing. So the test script themselves allow you to define multiple actors. And Joe Lamy is going to be talking more about that tomorrow in his talk. But then the actual test flow represents the workflow that you want to represent. So that's kind of an idea there off the top of my head. But I know having that sequence diagram, concretely defined, as the flow of information from one actor to another that's in there. Right now, that's just going to be part of the narrative that you could probably then point to reference from your concrete statement in your requirements resource, right? So that's another aspect that we have to think about too. Is now that we've got requirements with these statements, how do I link them back to the narrative back in the IG? So we want to be able to do anchors back into the narrative content from these little statement identifiers, if you will. And then that begs another set of questions. It's like, well, do I duplicate the descriptive of the statement in the narrative, or do I do it one place and then just simply reference? So a lot of things to still work out in that regard. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Richard.
All right. Thank you. So,
Enjoy the break.
Don't forget to give your feedback.